Good evening. Can you hear me okay? Oh, all right, good. I wasn't quite sure whether this was on, but it's probably on at just the right level, so I'm not hearing it like a big booming sound system, but you can hear it for sure. Okay, all right. Let us know if that's not the case. So my name is Frank Krebs. I'm the presiding bishop of the Ecumenical Catholic Communion. I have visited Rabbouni a couple of times before, so maybe some of you I've met on the occasions when I did that. I just want you to know how excited I have been to be able to be back this weekend again. And congratulations on 9 years. Can you believe it's been 9 years already? That's awesome. I really enjoy the time that I spend with Father Lawman and Father Kevin. They're just great people, good friends, and I enjoyed this time. So today, they asked me if I would present a little something about the Ecumenical Catholic Communion, and I thought what I would do to describe us and really to describe yourselves is to talk about where each of us belongs in the Catholic landscape. So maybe we could think of it like that. There's just a lot going on in the world of Catholicism, some of which you would agree with and want to participate in, some of which you perhaps would not. So I thought maybe just with some broad strokes I could kind of try to get at that a little bit. Let's think of it in terms of, I don't know if liberal and conservative is the word we want, although those terms are used for almost any organization today. But let's say maybe traditionalist and progressive, something like that. Now, on a spectrum where at one end you have traditionalists and the other end you have progressive, toward the center there are people who believe that both of those positions have value. Usually a traditionalist is someone who wants to hang on to the most important, essential elements of whatever the organization is about. In terms of the Catholic landscape, people want, if they're going to call themselves Catholic, they're holding on to Scripture, they're holding on to the early understandings of Jesus, that he was both God and man, the early understandings of the Trinity, which really isn't spelled out in Scripture, but was worked out later by the early believers. Those were the important creeds. Virtually all of Christianity subscribes to these. The fact that there's a system of pastoral service in the church. In the Catholic Church, we call those bishops, priests, and deacons. We've learned from dialogue with other churches, they have those roles even if they don't call them that. These are the sort of things that are essential to the Christian church. And also, of course, the Eucharist, what we're celebrating tonight, baptism, which is our entrance into the church, the other sacraments. These are like key, important things, and anyone who wanted to hang on to the tradition would see these elements of the tradition as very, very important. Now, we might bring them forward in a fresh way, but we don't want to discard them. If you go off to one end of this spectrum where we have conservatives or traditionalists, you get to a place where people are so rigid and so clinging to the way things used to be in the past that it's almost like the life has gone out of things. They're just kind of grasping at I don't know, the actions or something rather than whatever was supposed to be imbuing it with a sense of the heart. A lot of times you experience fear in people like this who seem to be so rigid. Just for them to be Catholic means you have to, let's say, for instance, always cross yourself before you receive the Eucharist or something, and they get all uptight about that. It's like the people at that end, I'm not saying that's a beautiful practice, but I mean, there's one way to do it where you're really putting your heart into it, another way to do it where you're just feeling like somehow I'm not Catholic if I don't do that. So that would be at that end. At this end of the spectrum, where people are wanting to be progressive, then we also see aberrations of that. But let's talk about good progressive attitudes. So just like a good traditionalist would want to carry on things that are really important from the past that we want to keep handing down, and then a good progressive or liberal is someone who says, things change. When the Word gets incarnate in a culture, the culture of the first century looks pretty different than the culture of the 21st century. So if God is still becoming incarnate, then God's going to become incarnate in a way that looks different than the way God was incarnate back then. So this is a new culture that needs to meet the Word of God, would be a way of saying it. So how do we grow? How do we adapt? How do we speak to the way that the world is changing? That's how a progressive tends to think. Now, some progressives at like the far end of that spectrum might get to the point where they would say, well, sort of anything goes, or we can't really say what Christianity is. It could mean this, it could that, and it's like sloppy agape or something like that. It's like we're really not sure what they're saying. In the center, I think the average wise person is trying to say, what should we keep because it's important, and how should we change because it's always important to adapt and to become incarnate in this particular culture. Now, what I'd like to particularly look at for a moment is what happens because I think most of us probably fall in the progressive camp, or we wouldn't be here tonight. So when we are operating out of our progressive selves in the broad Catholic landscape, what do most people do when they think about the changes they would like to see? Most people are hoping in the broad Catholic landscape. They're hoping that there will be a time when they could walk into church and see it as the normal thing that the priest who's celebrating the Eucharist would be married. And that would just be normal for them. Maybe they would meet the priest's spouse or the priest's children, and they would think, wouldn't that be wonderful? That would just be normal. I hope that someday there would be something like that. Maybe people would be hoping in the broad Catholic landscape that someday there would be a church where if you were divorced and remarried and the church hadn't annulled your marriage for one reason or another, that you wouldn't feel like you couldn't go to communion. Right? And so they don't necessarily feel I have any control over that future, but they want to hope for some time when that might happen. Or they might want to hope for that day when women are assuming a normal place in the church. Obviously, the church would have fallen apart a long time ago had it not been for women. This is obvious, but even though that's so obvious, why have women not been ordained in positions as deacon, priests, and bishops, for instance? And so people might hope that finally, someday in the Catholic landscape, you would see women presiding at the Eucharist, women preaching, women pastoring parishes. Why not that? And they would hope for something like that. They might hope that someday their gay cousins and aunts would somehow be welcome at church, that they wouldn't have to wear bags over their head when they came to church, but they would be welcomed and affirmed for exactly who they are. You might hope for a day like that. They might hope for a time when lay people aren't just passive in the church in terms of receiving orders as if we belong to an army where the priests and the bishops and the deacons are somehow the officers and the rest of us are just supposed to put everything into action and we have no say in what happens. But they might want to hope for a church where the voice of the laity is heard and makes a huge difference in how the church moves forward. They might hope for something like that. Maybe they would hope for a church where congregations would select their own pastors. Local groups of churches would select their own bishops. Hope. Now, sometimes when people hope for a day like this, in certain places on the Catholic landscape, they realize that there isn't like some big congress of lay people that you can go to with all your other lay folks and try to get something passed to make this change. You know, in certain parts of the Catholic landscape, that's not likely to happen. So what can you do besides just hoping? Well, you can actually fight. You can decide to, just like political organizers, you can say, we're going to do something to really make a change. And it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard work. But if we're clever, like Gandhi was able to get the United Kingdom out of India, you know, maybe if we're just clever and we really work at this hard, we might be able to affect some change in the Catholic landscape. And these are the fighters. I know one such woman. She lives in Rome. She has a small salary from a not-for-profit here in the United States that allows her to live into Rome and to work every day on the issue of women's ordination. She gets up early in the morning. She meets with other people. She schemes about how she can make change. She's very clever, bright, creative. And so just to give you one example of the type of thing that she does in this kind of warfare of trying to make a change, this way of being a soldier, she decided that she would meet with the press, because these are people who have access to certain leaders in the Vatican. They'll be interviewing cardinals on certain commissions. And she'll get together with the press and she'll say, I read the story that you wrote about Cardinal so-and-so last week, and I was really interested, but I noticed you never asked this. How about if you ask this kind of a question? This is what people really want to know. People I represent would really like to know their position on this. Why not just ask them? So she would do stuff like that. Sure enough, the press would start asking those questions. It would be in the news, and all of a sudden the concerns that she was concerned about were raised. And in fact, after working for a long, long time, there actually is a commission in Rome looking into the ordination of deacons, women as deacons. So it's a little baby step, but that's the kind of fighter she is, and she's been working away at it, and that's what you do. So some people who hope want to soldier up, want to fight. I guess it depends on what you're called to. That may be something that some people in the Catholic landscape can do with their hope, if they want to, is to try to fight for change. Now, the way we've chosen to exercise our hope is different from that. We're not soldiering up. We're not fighting against anything. We're not trying to get someone else to change. In our part of the Catholic landscape, we're more like architects or contractors or construction supervisors, builders, carpenters, engineers, people who are saying, this is the kind of church that we want and that we are capable of having, and we're going to build it. And we didn't just invent this, just pull it out of the air, just say, you know what, let's make a church like this, like we just got it out of nowhere. No, we found, just like some people who grow up in families where they don't quite get along in their particular nuclear family, but they find out that their aunt and uncle, same last name, have a lot in common, but hanging out at their house is a whole lot easier. Just feels better. You can breathe over there. And so some people have done that in their lives. They just start hanging out with other elements of the family, and sure enough, there's a branch of Catholicism which has been alive since this group was excommunicated from Rome in 1724. They finally started gathering up. That was one diocese in the Netherlands. They started gathering up with other disaffected Catholics in the late 1800s. And this tradition is still alive and well in Europe and in the United States. And that's what many of us have done, is join the tradition of Catholicism that is independent of Rome, but is still fighting for ancient ways of doing Catholicism. We still value the ancient tradition that we have, but we also prize some things that Rome kind of evolved out of, would be a nice way to put it. We'll say that they just pursued a different trajectory, which allowed the Pope to become a lot more powerful and bishops to become a lot more powerful. Whereas in the early church, things were decided by the whole church. The bishops had a say, the priests had a say, and so did the lay people have a say. Check out Acts 15 in the New Testament. A whole chapter on the decision that the church is making. The apostles had to agree, the presbyters had to agree, and the whole church had to agree before they came up with this decision. So this other strain of Catholicism that we have moved over to because we don't want to fight, we would rather be building something beautiful that looks like the way we think the church is called to be. So we joined something actually ancient that allows us to do these things. And also they figured out hundreds of years ago that really in the early church, the Pope did not appoint bishops. Bishops are not appointed. People have said to me, how can you be a bishop when the Pope didn't appoint you? Well, in the early church, the local church elected their own bishops. And then those bishops were ordained by the surrounding bishops in other areas. That's how bishops come to be in the ancient church. It's still true in the Orthodox Church. It's still true in the Catholics I'm telling you about in Europe and the United States. And it's probably the way that eventually Rome will go back to, because it's the way that it was done in the beginning, and it's the way all other churches who have a role like this have chosen to operate. So I would suspect that they're going to do that. But we do that. We select our own pastors, we select our own bishops, and when we do that, we choose leaders that we relate to, leaders whom we think are saying something that makes sense to us, rather than somebody who's coming in with a message that doesn't seem to relate to us at all. So this, in the entire Catholic landscape, to sum up, we are a church that still wants to balance the values that we're carrying on from the past and the important things that we believe that are core to our faith. But we also believe that it's important to have the gospel meet the culture. One theologian who belongs to this church in Utrecht, where I went to summer school a few years ago, he put it, he was, I think he was 28 years old, a brand new theologian for this awesome church in Netherlands. But he said that the way that we ought to respond to the culture is to see the culture as knocking on our door. And then we have the question we can ask ourselves, are we going to be hospitable, or are we just going to say, no, we never entertain anyone knocking at our door? Well, what about just allowing them to come in, allowing the culture to come in and having a conversation? Could that be so bad? Try to find out what they think, see if there is some way that the gospel can relate to their questions, to their ways of seeing things. That's the way that we would proceed, rather than always being so reactive to the culture, as if the culture is bad. You know, it's the way people are living. Why not engage with them and find out if there's a way that we can engage with them? So we want to be people who carry on the important things of the past. We want to be able to engage with the culture, and we want to be able to do it in a way where we're building something without fighting. I think it's cool that people want to fight and make changes in places where that's what it's going to take. I appreciate that. But I don't think that's what we've chosen to do. We've instead chosen to build. And I want to just end by making a reference to this beautiful gospel and the themes that we've had in these first Sundays of the year of God personally calling us. This church, for us to be able to succeed, to make a beautiful church and to have it be a second generation experience of this kind of Catholicism, is going to require that each of us be committed to it. This isn't a passive church. It can't be. It's got to be the kind of church where you feel a call to be one of those builders, to be one of the engineers, one of the carpenters, one of the masons, one of the architects, somewhere on the team where you're making it happen. That's really the only way it's going to happen. This passive approach for this kind of church won't work. It's got to be a kind of church where we're all hands on deck and we all are responsible for our futures. Not as if God doesn't have anything to do with it. Obviously, we all would fall dead if God were not breathing life into us every second. So it's understood that we're doing this with God. but it also means that we too are picking up the tools of the trade and doing our part in building. That's the kind of church that I want to be a part of. Is that the kind of church that you want to be a part of? I can see you shaking your heads yes, and I know that it's true or you wouldn't be here. Thanks for letting me be here with you today.